Well, welcome everyone to our last session of Reading Pilgrimage Together, at least for our 2022 group. As I've mentioned before, I do hope to organize something like this again in the future, but not for 2023. And so first of all, congratulations to all of you for making it through all 13 volumes. I know it's been a long journey, and Dorothy Richardson does not always make it easy for us, but I think that's also one of the reasons it's a challenging and rewarding experience, is that she really does demand a lot of her readers, and if you go along, I think there's many things to be gained from it. So I'm just going to do a brief introduction. Most of this is really kind of be a wrap-up discussion, and it's open for everybody to participate. We're very fortunate here. Rebecca Bowler from Kiel has come back and joined us again, who is one of our first experts to participate. And I think everybody agrees that the support we've had of Richardson scholars has been absolutely fabulous, and one of the things that's made this such a worthwhile group. So let me just jump into the presentation part of the program. So this is our last session, having to look at my awful slides. However, obviously, people are free to continue tweeting with the pilgrimage together. And I think if you've been following the traffic on Twitter, you'll see that people have kind of as we've gone along, there have been people who are late starters who are still working their way through and speaking about the things they're getting from that experience. And I certainly want to encourage that. The Reading Pilgrimage site is up, and it'll stay up for an indefinite amount of time. And there'll be occasionally stuff added to that. I meant to add more stuff in the last month, but unfortunately I've been swamped with other commitments. And here we are now, the final and shortest book of the entire series, or the entire novel. And that's kind of the point of departure, I think, for today's discussion, is this whole question about where March Moonlight fits in the scope of the entire work. I think most folks have been reading using the Virago Modern Classics edition. This is a challenge for readers outside the Commonwealth countries because it's not technically in print. And one of the things I'm tempted to do, I am in contact with Donna Coonan, who is the editor of the VMC series, which, if you're a VMC lover, it's probably not lost that it does seem that the publisher has sort of dropped its support of this amazing series, and Pilgrimage in particular, over the course of the last decade. A lot of those VMCs are no longer in print. I've contacted her, as well as the Marsh Agency, which holds the rights to Dorothy Richardson's estate, about getting a new edition put out, or at least getting all volumes published and available outside the Commonwealth countries. And both parties are open to it in theory, but I think they need a bit of a push. So I'm tempted to put an online poll out there to see just how many people would support seeing the books brought and made available outside Commonwealth countries. I suspect we probably wouldn't get much more than dozens of readers, but anything we can do to get these available, because to me, this is one of the considerations about running this kind of group again, which is whether or not the books are going to be accessible, because that's one of the first criteria for getting anybody excited about reading a book, is how easy is it to get. And I think most of you know that I have this neglected books website, and when I discuss with scholars the work of writers whose work is difficult to find, that's usually the first obstacle they bring up, which is, how can I get a copy? And then the second question is always, has somebody written about her recently? Because everybody, it seems to be, sorry, Rebecca, but academics seem to love to be the second person to publish on somebody or on a book, but they don't want to be the icebreaker, so to speak. So here we are in January with the March Moonlight, and I guess the graduation ceremony. I haven't made up any gowns or pins or anything like that. I've done all 13 volumes of Pilgrimage, but you all deserve it for making it through, because it's not always the easiest journey. And here we are with March Moonlight, which was never published separately. It was collected in volume 4 of the 1967 edition that came out from J.W. Dent and Alfred Knopf. And it's somewhat controversial in the sense that it's the first question is it a finished work, and where does it fit in the scope of Pilgrimage? And with that, I will stop these things. And I wanted to offer a couple of perspectives on that first question, and then we can open up for a broader discussion. That first question about March Moonlight and how does it fit within the scope of Pilgrimage, and is Pilgrimage completed? So I'm just going to take a couple of three perspectives to offer for you. First is from John Rosenberg's biography. This was the first, I would say, mainstream trade biography that came out about Richardson. And he's of the school that says this is the finishing touch. So right at the end of his book, he writes, "The remaining typescript chapters of the last volume of Pilgrimage were now read, and it was seen that Dorothy had succeeded before dying in her aim of completing the circle of her work, bringing it in this last chapter, March Moonlight, published posthumously in 1967, to the point where Miriam, in her Queen's Terrace lodging house, meets the strange, lost, shabby, courteous young man whom we recognize as Alan Odell, and where also she is about to embark on the novel that we, identifying with her and her creator, know to be her pilgrimage." So he's kind of saying, because in terms of chronology, the book closes at the point where Dorothy Richardson became a full-time writer. The next perspective is from her other biographer, Gloria Fromm, and Fromm is a little more skeptical about it. So Fromm writes, and I didn't mention this on the site, but the first three chapters of March Moonlight were actually published in serial form in a magazine called Life and Letters in the late 40s. So Fromm writes, "After the first three chapters were published in Life and Letters, nothing more of the novel appeared in print until the omnibus edition was reissued in 1967, with the last volume containing the whole of March Moonlight as Dorothy had finally left it. There were 10 typescript chapters totaling 162 pages and an estimated 40,000 words. The average length of her last three novels had been 55,000 words. Statistically, it is probable that her 13th volume was more than 2/3 complete, but on her own testimony, only the first three chapters had undergone revision. The remaining 7, though vivid and accomplished in some passages, have a thin and hurried quality. The movement and action are extremely condensed, and I think all of us would agree that's true. New and important characters appear almost as if they had been pressed into being by the button of a jack-in-a-box. At the same time, Dorothy dated events in the novel more explicitly than she had ever done before, having them pointedly occur between 1908 and 1912, but the last 2 years pass virtually in a single phrase. Apparently, she was straining to reach the year 1913 when Pointed Roofs had been finished. So that's kind of more implying that, yes, it was a work in progress when she died and not complete. And the final perspective, which I think takes kind of an orthogonal view to it comes from Horace Gregory's wonderful book, Dorothy Richardson, An Adventure in Self-Discovery, where he says, and this is not at the end of the book, but it kind of is in his finishing review. Much of Gregory's book is kind of a review of both Pilgrimage and Richardson's life, walking through the volumes one by one. Her pilgrimage had begun in an aura of guilt. Guilt for her mother's suicide, guilt for her sense of shame at her father's humiliation, guilt for her own differentness. This aura had lingered throughout the course of her early life, throughout the span of years recounted in the first 12 sections of Pilgrimage. In March Moonlight, the guilt is faced, articulated, and in a sense, overcome. And to me, I think that's a great starting point for discussion, which is to say, you know, it's an issue that I think we would agree Richardson she's always tangential in her treatment of some of the most significant moments in Miriam's life. Most dramatically, of course, the suicide of her mother. So this whole idea that essentially that guilt, which is essentially what Gregory, and I think he may be the only critic to really ride the guilt train, so to speak, through Richardson, to pick up that as a core topic and to argue that essentially the most important aspect of March Moonlight is that she moves beyond, if you will, this, you know, constant denial of guilt and avoidance of guilt. So I just wanted to throw that out because I think that's a nice departure point to kind of look at it. It isn't necessarily the only way into or out of the series, but it's if you've stuck with it, it's hard not to have thought on occasion, what is going on that she is so evasive when it comes to these topics. And if anybody wants to chime in with some thoughts, I'd be happy that. I'm sure you don't want to hear me continue to pipe along. Any comments? Is guilt a critical issue, a core issue, or is that just one reader's interpretation?
Well, I was just so wrapped up in the whole sense of her becoming a writer as she ends her thing in the writing business and the meditative power of, I think it's Phyllis Rose talks about her being an observer, creator, mediator, interpreter, contemplator of her own creation, new interpreter, and so forth, in perpetual condition of re-experience. And so that guilt could be part of that. But to me, I got the whole phenomenological, whatever those feelings were, that just kept washing over me with this. In a funny way, I almost felt like I wanted to just start reading Pointed Moves again right away, because I just felt like we'd just done this whole circle back again. So that's just where I was at. So the guilt thing does fit in. And it's funny to me in this volume, which had some very tough passages. I actually reread the first 20 pages twice to try to get through, but I got there. But I was surprised at how, to me, the switching from first person to third person didn't jar as much. I almost felt like, oh, this is Dorothy, this is Miriam. Oh, yeah, okay. I can go back and forth. I don't really care who it is. And the fact that I think we talked about this earlier, the actual word Miriam is only mentioned twice, right? And so that's something we might want to, Rebecca might want to pursue some more. But anyway, that's just me, yeah.
Well, I wanted to offer just one other perspective. This is something I just recently read, which is a little book by a novelist named Ava Tucker, and it's essentially built around a talk she gave in Cornwall about Richardson. And in that, she makes a comment, and she's one of the few writers to really pointedly discuss the issue of switching first and third person. But I was struck by what she said. She said, all the way through Pilgrimage, the first and third persons alternate. Well, I don't think it's all the way through. It really happens a number of volumes in before we start to see those switches. But in any case, she says, she attributes this to a symptom of her, Richardson's, alienation from herself. The sense that truth and love could reside in any one particular face had eroded. So Tucker, in this essay, she takes a very religious interpretation of Richardson, religion with a generic sense of essentially saying that part of what was going on is that Miriam is encountering a variety of religions and saying in each particular form, she finds something that she can't entirely embrace, but she takes a very religious approach to life, essentially.
I think maybe one of the problems that we face in reading March Moonlight, but Pilgrimage more broadly, is if you do want to take the one, absolute angle and say this is what Pilgrimage is about. It's about guilt. It's about Miriam working through her guilt. It's about Miriam coming to a religious sense that isn't the narrow idea of religion and morality that she's grown up with, or this is Miriam becoming a writer, and therefore she needs to get to the point where she's sitting down to write Pilgrimage by the end of the novel, or this is Miriam's, working out of how she feels about love and relationships. It is every single one of these, and I think March Moonlight, in part, the problems of March Moonlight is that it tries to encapsulate and draw together all of these different threads, and I think you can see that in the jumping about. So, for example, loneliness versus connectedness. We've got right at the beginning, this kind of letter writing of, I've had a kind of fling with this woman called Jean, and it's going well enough that we don't actually spend time with each other, but we are writing letters to each other. And you think, okay, is that the ultimate perfect relationship, one where you don't have to actually be together in the same space? Or and then she's back with her family, and someone's had a baby, and then she's reminiscing about Dimple Hill, and she's getting letters from Rachel Mary, and she's trying to bring together all the different things, which I think is why you get all of this jumping around. She's also thinking a lot about her writing. She's thinking a lot about writing the middles in March Moonlight. And I had a quick look before this meeting, and I don't have the full manuscript on this computer at home, but in the manuscript she does quite a lot more writing about the middles and about what the editors told her about how marketable they are, and how much she enjoys writing them. So she's clearly trying to bring that in as well. So I think the problem that we're facing is the problem that she was facing too, which is, how do you bring to any kind of conclusion a novel as big and sprawling and multifaceted and complicated as Pilgrimage, right? It's impossible. So she could do that by being reductive, by making it small, but she's not going to do that. She could do it by making it gigantic, but that obviously with her failing health, proved to be impossible. And so we have this, weird, unfinished text instead.
I also have to go back to her repeated references to how one reads a book, right? And if you can't just pick up a book anywhere and start reading it, then it's not a good book. And that's that feeling I sort of got at the end of this, was I could just start going anywhere. And I wondered, Rebecca, if I think some other scholar talked about many of Miriam's comments about writing and novels and the metaphorocracy, which I kind of liked, and reflect Miriam's view of the work in which she is a character. I mean, it's again, but if you could go into some of that, the the likes and dislikes of Dorothy Richardson in terms of what she wanted to write or liked to read, I'd like to hear that.
Well, first of all, I was thinking when Brad was introducing, I think it's really significant that she thinks about her upcoming career as a writer, as a novelist, particularly, or as a writer of middles at this point, or this sense that she's, racing to get to the point where she sits down to write Pilgrimage, because of course, what she's been reading for kind of the past 20 years, over and over and over again, is Proust. She says in letters she's reading Proust again. She's reading Proust forwards, backwards. This is a direct quote, by the way, forwards, backwards, upside down. So she's reading bits of Proust and then other bits of another volume, other bits of another volume. She says she leaves the volumes around her house so that she can pick one up, read a little bit, put it down, pick another one up, read a little bit, put it down. She's absolutely immersed in Proust, and I think that's a significant influence. I love the metaphorocracy as well. And she says that in an interview. She talks about, she writes a very silly response to some interview questions where, it's, if you weren't a novelist, what would you do? And she says, I would be the founder of a society to broadcast the goings on of metaphors, what they're up to. And I just think that's wonderful, So she's very concerned with the ways in which you can make things allegories, or the ways that you can make things abstract, or the ways you can make things mean something other than what they might initially appear to mean. But she's also very distrustful of that, and she feels like metaphors need to be kept an eye on. And I think that's something you see throughout Pilgrimage. Towards the end in March Moonlight as well, I think she's coming to some mature realizations of her self-sufficiency. And that's something that obviously, again, if we think of Pilgrimage begins with Miriam leaving home, that's important. She may have left home, but she hasn't necessarily disentangled herself from, what she thinks, her family mean to her, or what her identity is with relation to her family. And she's started to do that. I'm not sure she has finished, but she has come some way towards doing that in March Moonlight, and I think that's important too. I don't know, I'd like to open this up though, because I think that there could be, 100 answers to this question. There's so much in it.
It's interesting your comment about the family is that quite a few characters from the first couple of volumes make cameo appearances in March Moonlight. There were several times where I was thinking of the ending of the series 6 Feet Under, where in the last 3 minutes you see what happens to all the characters, because they want to wrap it up in a neat bow, and I get a sense that was part of what Richardson was struggling with, particularly in the later chapters, that there's kind of I think as one writes a book, nobody writes it beginning to end straight. I mean, somebody probably does, but I can't do it. Is that you have places where you put down thoughts, and you might put down a passage, but it's not really joined up. And the last chapters of March Moonlight, to me, remind me of a manuscript left kind of incomplete, which is that she walked away from it and she wasn't in a position to come back again and finish it. There's been a couple of comments in the chat about the whole idea of this being a story about the education or emergence of a writer. And someone last month talked about the German kunstlerroman tradition, which I'm sure Richardson would have been aware of. Although I think it also exists, not that I've read it, but the big novel, Jean-Christophe, French novel, is a similar sort of thing about the development of a composer, musician. So it's a tradition that's been out there for a while, and it certainly is one probably legitimate way to look at the book. Well, let me
Well,
throw out a broader question then, which is for you as readers, how would you compare your expectations at the start of the year with where you feel now, having gotten all the way through the book?
That's a really interesting question, Brad. Just kind of spontaneous response to that is that the book has gone much deeper than I expected. Going back to my feelings around Pointed Roofs, I think I found it quite delightful and exhilarating and kind of different than whatever picture I had in my mind it was going to be. But the book has gone to darker corners, and I really like the way it is unfinished, actually, because that captures the essence of the experience of it for me. There's so many kind of quotes and passages in March Moonlight that you could focus on, but I was just flipping through and seeing some things that I kind of highlighted, and there was a phrase in the Virago edition on page 638, the strangeness of the adventure of being. And I kind of feel that captures the whole experience of pilgrimage. But going back to your question, getting to this point is a really different place for me than where I was when I was reading Pointed Roofs.
That's a great point. And I think that certainly Tucker in her book stresses the idea that essentially Richardson's quest to continually explore what is being and how do you have sensations, and essentially the instant by instant experience of being in the world, that she was constantly trying to capture that and translate it into words. And I think that is one of the great things about the book, is that it means that instant by instant means that you have to deal with fear, you have to deal with dread, you have to deal with anticipation and delight and all those gamut of emotions that one encounters in the course of one day, let alone years of one's life.
Yeah, and I don't remember who, but somebody I've read in a secondary source on pilgrimage talks about the kind of counterpoint of being and becoming throughout the series. And again, in this March Moonlight, there are a few comments where I can't really remember what the secondary source said, but it was something about becoming, as I recall, it was something about a social persona, whereas being is being much more in touch with the essence of who you are. And there's definitely something on that in March Moonlight on page 635. So March Moonlight seems to like pick up a lot of threads in the tapestry, and they come back again. They're not fully knotted and tied, but they're there again to reflect on. And a lot of those threads for me weren't present, not surprisingly, when I was reading Pointed Roofs, but they were hinted at. And I do plan to go back to Pointed Roofs to a few passages, and I'm sure they're going to read differently now, having read everything,
Absolutely.
including March Moonlight.
Well,
If
I
I
think
could ask, yeah,
Go
if I
ahead.
could just ask Brad, your idea about and Karen, your idea about the being and becoming. I mean, that's one of her big bones she likes to pick with hypo, right? And men, but also, so she's got this whole thing, passage after passage about studying something and getting sunk into this meditative space and all that business. And then she says, but of course, if you're writing, you're cutting yourself off from life, right? She has that whole debate of, how can I live life if I'm going to be writing? And so the fact that we're reading her novel about wanting to live life and not live it, we're caught up in the same problem she's having, right? We're experiencing, at least I'm experiencing what she's wrestling with a little bit.
Yeah, I sort of read that as she discovers that writing is the way to be herself.
Right.
And that in meditation, sort of traditional meditation, which I haven't been able to find any connections to validate whether she knew a lot about this or not, but that there's a lot of talk about accessing that presence, which you can do through activities like writing, anything that sort of puts you into contact with the flow of experience in life. And traditional meditation would be sitting and getting there, but it feels like she gets there through her writing, but also through nature, I think.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I would recommend, Karen, if you're interested, that's very much the thrust of Ava Tucker's discussion in her essay in this book, which if you just look, it's
Right.
called The Enchanted Guest of Spring and Summer, Dorothy Richardson by Ava Tucker.
Is that Ava with an E or an A? I can
With
I'm
an
sure.
E. Yeah,
Okay.
not
Thank
like
you.
garden. And I just two things. First of all, in the chat is an aspect of the book that I want to make sure we touch on, which is the experience of hundreds and hundreds of pages of the world seen through a woman's eyes, which, speaking as a man, that's one of the things I found most profoundly moving about reading Pilgrimage. But let's go back to that issue of of the experience of a writer. And in some ways, and I'm sure I'm not the first to say this, which is the incompleteness of March Moonlight. In fact, I think, even though it's lovely, as it was pointed out when we had our discussion with the folks in Tasmania back in May, that the final word in the book is fulfillment, which is a great word to end on. It's at the end of a sentence where she's kind of having this discussion about, am I missing out on life because I wasn't a mother? So to me, it's a fragmentary ending. I cannot believe that Richardson said, that's the last sentence I want in this book. And honestly, I feel like I'll get, is that it reminded me very much of Finnegan's Wake, where essentially you're never going to get out of the book because you hit the end of it and you just go back to the beginning. I mean, the first and the last words are River Run. So it is this kind of Mobius strip of a novel. And the fact that you're finishing it, so many readers say they finish it and want to start over again, is one demonstration of that. And so I will shut up and invite Rebecca to join in.
Out to me, which was that word fulfillment was not the final line in the manuscript. She started writing again. There's a whole nother passage,
Right.
which she then crossed out. So when the editors were putting it together for publication, they thought, well, this is crossed out, so therefore it's it's not her intention to have this in, but it did seem to be her intention to carry on. So she kind of asks, doesn't she? Is this holding a child in your arms, is this the thing, the meaning of life? Is this what it is? And then she starts the next passage, no. But then she decides she doesn't like that, it doesn't work for whatever reason, she crosses it out. So obviously then, in putting that together for publication, you without any seances in order to ask her what she meant to do next, you have to say, okay, well, her final intention, as far as we know, is that this passage doesn't stand, so therefore it ends here. But that gives a very potentially misleading idea of the ending, because we do love endings. We love to have a nice, neat ending, and we don't get one.
Absolutely. And I, just for everybody's reference, if you didn't catch it, I did tweet maybe about a week ago the annotations that Richardson crossed out, which absolutely open up. If you think that was a point of closure, Richardson's comments merely open up the discussion yet again. in a wonderful way. So I may, if you haven't caught that, it's worth taking a look at, because it really does say, hey, no, I haven't come to a definitive answer in this. So I wanted to go to Jennifer's comment about the fact that this is a book where you spend, hundreds and hundreds of pages seeing the world, not just through a woman's eyes, but through the eyes of a woman who is so vigorously resisting the attempts of the world to force anybody else's perspective on her. And to me, this is one of the reasons I can't believe this book isn't available in every bookstore, and women trooping in every day and buying a copy, because where else are you going to find somebody taking such an adamant viewpoint that, this is my view of the world and I have every right to it. But that's me speaking as a man, so please.
Oh, you're absolutely right. Speaking as a woman, you're absolutely right. But also, not only that, but this is my experience. This is my point of view. I have a right to it. You have to hear it, but also you have to hear it unrelentingly with no other viewpoints. Nothing to break that up, to mediate that. No apologies. This is just it. Deal with it.
Anyone else want to chime in on this whole idea of pilgrimage as a monument, a masterpiece of the woman's place in the world?
Well, I think what we're talking about is that we just are jumping into her head and her world, and it's messy and it's, kind of disorganized, and she doesn't have a lot of time because she's working all the time, and her life is in disarray because her mother has committed suicide and her father has let her down, and the men in her life don't seem quite to be what she hoped they would be, and the world isn't as she expected it to be, which would be to expect to respect her as much as she would like to be respected. And so I think that's just, what I loved is that we just got thrown messily into all that, and we leave messily from all that 13 volumes later. And, we don't get that. We get that in Joyce to some extent, but to get it just from this messy brain trying to deal with really horrific tragedy, it's just wonderful. And, it did stop kind of where it stopped. And sure, I would love to have heard more, but I just feel like this is a point of time and a snapshot, a long snapshot, but a snapshot. And I'm really quite just happy to have had it and to have been in it. And by now my questions have kind of subsided, and I'm just feel kind of a gentle love of Miriam and her experience.
I wanted to ask, we've got her with us today, and she's kind of deserves the credit for getting this all started. Is Kim, you haven't been able to take part of many of these discussions, but I wanted to let you, if you're ready to offer some thoughts, since what were your expectations when you your enthusiasm kind of got this thing going. Where you are now, what do you feel about the journey?
Yeah, it's I don't think I knew what I was getting myself into. And I loved it. I love the entire journey. I love that it is all from a woman's perspective. I love that there's this kind of play between Dorothy Richardson and Miriam of really like looking back at her life and the tragedy that she's had in her life and all the things that she's gone through. And sometimes she's removing herself and just using Miriam as that kind of front piece. And then at other times she's more a part of it. And I think that's interesting from just psychologically, as far as allowing herself to be a part of it versus the times that she needs to not be a part of it. So I just felt like I was really immersed in this journey with her. And I love how there's parts where you're really identifying with what she's saying. And then there's other parts where you're completely lost in what she's saying. And you're fine with it. You're just along that journey with her of really like diving into these things. And I identify with Miriam in her just need of solitude and space. So that was really lovely for me. So it's been a beautiful journey. I'm so glad. And I'm so glad it was spaced out too, that to do it slowly and to be able to sit with it for periods before picking up the next volume was, I think, also really like added to the journey for me. So, and it's been so fun to get to hear everybody's thoughts and perspectives on it and what's resonated with people versus the parts that they've been lost in. And I've loved it.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to offer a quote that is from Richardson, but it's in Ava Tefker's book. It's apparently a piece that Richardson wrote about Joyce and specifically Finnegan's Wake, but it's a lovely piece of advice to anybody encountering pilgrimage, which is enter the text and look innocently about.
That's perfect. I like that.
Yeah, I mean, what a great guide to anybody jumping into this environment. I'm sorry, Rebecca, I'm having a hard time hearing you.
Oh,
If you could-
sorry. Am I quiet or am I just not on?
I think you're just quiet, or your gain
Oh.
on your mic might be down.
Am I loud now?
Perfect.
There we go. I love that review of Joyce of Finnegan's Wake. I think it's one of my favorite pieces of her non-pilgrimage writing. She calls it adventure for readers, which I think just sums up her attitude to fiction. Phyllis was asking, what's her attitude to reading novels, and I think that's it. Give the reader an adventure, give them the chance to collaborate, as she says elsewhere, but also she says in that piece that the reader should plunge provisionally here and there, enter the text and look innocently about. And that also kind of seems to speak to this idea of what she was doing with Proust, of like picking up the volumes and reading them out of order, that eventually the whole thing is gonna hang about you, and you're going to have access to the whole thing, but you don't necessarily need to read it in order. And that to me is such a radical actually approach to reading fiction. How many of us actually do that? Maybe that's the next challenge, Brad. Maybe we should all read Pilgrimage, but just in the wrong order.
Yeah.
Julio
And
Cortázar.
she says somewhere that the plot doesn't matter. And that was a great relief. Because I thought I've always had problems with plots. And somehow it was very reassuring to have Dorothy Richardson say that the plot didn't matter. And it's what you take away from the experience that matters.
Absolutely. I mean, that perspective alone gives this work a gold star as a piece of modernism, because that was quite, when she started, I mean, that was really not known. In fact, one could argue she was starting to write. If you look at the sorts of novels that were being commonly published in 1913, they were about as traditional, and I mean, they were all very, very chronological narratives. I mean, I find reading from that period for non-modernist writers is almost suffocating to me, because it's so bound up with a convention. And Richardson just said, forget it.
Yeah, I've actually found by reading this that when I go back to books that are more just a typical structure, it's boring. You want to I want to dive back into that, like not necessarily always following what's being said.
It's funny in the discussion we had that Scott McCracken and I had with Kim and Amy from the Lost Ladies of Lit, I think that's the perspective they got as well, and they mentioned it in the podcast, which is, the first reaction was, Jesus, what have I gotten into? What the hell is going on? And if you recall, I think we had them start off with Deadlock.
Yeah, I was going to say you just dumped them in right in the middle.
Yeah. Which was an interesting test of the theory that plot doesn't matter, because yeah. And in fact, I think, just a comment that one of the reasons that I would want to go back and read this again is that it didn't occur to me, and I forget who mentioned it. It might have been Brian E. Randall, but the whole idea that Richardson's ability to convey the maturing of Miriam's perspective in the course of the book, that if you read Pointer's Roofs, this is a teenage, naive young woman encountering the world. And then if you were to leap forward to Dimple Hill, for example, this is a woman who is seeing many, many nuances and has become very jaded about certain things, and but at the same time has developed some kind of confidence in her own opinions and perspectives that wasn't there with Pointed Roofs.
Can I ask the group a question? This is something that I'd forgotten was puzzling me until it was mentioned just a little bit earlier in this chat, which is I find it really interesting that she brings Alan Ozell in briefly in her kind of race to kind of get up to date, to come back up to the present day. And he just kind of appears as a token. I remember George H. Thompson explains that as sentimentality. I don't think he means it in a pejorative way, but trying to get her husband in to the end of the book, and that's nice. But she starts the book with allusions to an affair, or at least a very intense friendship that she's been having with a woman called Jean. So it feels like, if she wanted to conclude something about her sexuality, what is that conclusion? I mean, is there a conclusion? Did anybody have any thoughts on that? Because I thought it was quite interesting to have both those things in the final volume together.
I just want to say that the discussions about possible lesbian aspects of Miriam and that theme all seem to concentrate in Amabel, and yet Jean seems a far more powerful relationship.
Jean does, but to me, Jean felt it was more of a kindred spirited, a spiritual connection. There's a lot in Dimple Hill. There's something about being side by side rather than confronting. And that language of side by side comes up quite a few times in the early part of March Moonlight in relation to Jean. And I found the whole thing with Jean quite tantalizing, actually, because it felt like it was the relationship that really was about connection for Miriam, but we don't get enough of it. We just get a sort of vignette of it. And then the other thing I find interesting about March Moonlight, which it's interesting we haven't touched on yet, is really there's so much plot in it in terms of development in relation to Michael and Amabel's marriage, and also other characters like Olga, who commits suicide quite abruptly. Yeah, I'm sort of straying from your question, Brad, a bit like reading Pilgrimage, isn't it? But Yeah, there are those two bookends, as you say, Jean and the Alan Odell sort of shadowy character. But then there are other important characters and plot connections that crop up as well. I don't know if anyone else has anything to say about this. I found the whole Michael Amabel meeting really quite fascinating. Yes, I'll stop there.
Well, there are many threads for not, and that's certainly one that simply the perspective. One of the things I was struck by in that particular chapter is that was, you know, the nuanced view of the fact that marriages are not happily ever after. You know, that had become a much broader thing that was written about between the time that Richardson started her book in the teens, and by the late 40s and 50s, you had Elizabeth Bowen, you had, you know, dozens of novelists dealing with the fact that people can get married and find themselves miserable together.
So do you feel she was making a kind of social point?
Oh gosh, no, I felt that it was just, you know, one more bit of evidence in her case against fitting into a particular social relationship paradigm.
Which is interesting because the way that she describes Michael and Amabel when she's put them together is that she's arranged them like a picture. So she's put them in a pleasing arrangement to each other, and she's very pleased with herself for doing that. So they're stuck in a paradigm and should be, but she does not do that. She does not go into, you know, she does not join any group. She does not fit into any box. She is outside of that, but everybody else does and should, is the implication, I think, there. Or almost as well, you know, again, thinking back to what Veronica Grad said later about Richardson being controlling of them and their relationship. You know, she wants to tidy them up towards the end of Pilgrimage. They're both kind of loose threads, both narratively and in terms of, you know, people who potentially can complicate her life. So pairing them off together is a very convenient solution for fiction and for living, which seems like a very odd way of thinking about the people in your life, but I think that is in part at least what she's doing there.
I wondered if it was partly the big theme of freedom, that in pairing Michael up with Amabel, it enabled the Miriam character, Richardson, to be free. So that was quite interesting. I have to say my personal interest in the March Moonlight reappearance of Michael and Amabel was this phrase that echoes from earlier in the book, where Amabel says she would love to see Michael's children with their beady eyes, which I found such a kind of, I don't know, disturbing phrase, actually, in a way, beady eyes. So I was looking for a reference back to that, but I don't think there is one.
It's also a way for her to show what she didn't like about them and why she rejected them. I think their relationship is not very satisfying at the end, and you know, she's showing she did the right thing.
It's interesting in that meeting where Michael makes what I think she calls a sarcastic comment. Oh, you are a good friend. I think he was hoping she would encourage Amabel to be happy with her lot, and she doesn't do that.
Good luck with that.
Another marriage that she really skewers is that of her sister, Harriet, and how Harriet's become unctuously voiced like her in-laws, and how the remnants of her former house, the Henderson house, are on the wall, and then the mirror that the in-laws gave to reflect their presence all the time, and the children slyly batting their lids and not batting their lids. And she talks about sisters and her sisters, and it was in that passage about Harriet of whether her sister is really like herself or not. And that seemed to be kind of out of the blue a little bit. And I didn't feel very resolved, other than Eve conveniently is dead. And maybe it wasn't Harriet, maybe it was Sally, the sister that's here, not the one that's in America. I just wondered what you might think about the sisters in all this. I guess not much.
There's so much
Well,
to think about. It's like it's going in so
it-
many different places.
I know, which is kind of fun too, because that's the way it's that the old monkey brain, right? When you're, I keep thinking, okay, am I having monkey brain or am I reading Dorothy Richardson right now?
Well,
It
I'll
does
just
give-
toss in a comment that I think Scott made in the podcast that we did together, which was that many times when Richardson is writing about her sisters, she's kind of insistently taking this perspective that any of us would about our family members, which is we don't do what a traditional narrative would do, which is to kind of set those thoughts in a frame, a contextual frame, because she was saying she's her sister. She would just like spontaneously think something about her and then pass off to another thought, and not even, if you, we've all come through the holiday seasons and probably had family encounters that if you think back on them, you remember a moment, you remember an expression, you remember just a snapshot. You don't think through the incident of coming through the door, and that, again, the linear chronological approach to remembering experiences. And I think that, in particular, talking about her sisters, that's a very illuminating thought, which the next time I read it, I'll certainly take that with me when we come to those passages, and I think it could be said of many things that Miriam often just spontaneously thinks about someone and then moves on to something else. And that's one of the, Kim talked about the challenges of Richardson's writing, but once you kind of understand the approach she's taking, then so many other writers seem to be bringing crutches and frames and supports and trying to make your life easy as a reader.
And she does not want to make our lives easy. That's so interesting, the sisters. I'm trying to think about it. I think my general sense is that Harriet has always been her closest sister. They're closer in age, and they shared a room when they were children, so they were always the ones that were always together. Eve has always been a bit of a kind of a counterpoint to Miriam. She was more sensible, more meek, although she wasn't really. She was actually quite independent. She's the first person to go off and be a governess, and then Miriam kind of copies her afterwards. So it's not quite as straightforward. And then Sarah, Sally is older, and so more distant, more mature, maybe looked up to, but also not as close as any of the other sisters. So with Harriet, who's Jessie in real life, who did go to America in real life, with her in America, she's lost the closest connection that she has. But also I think, and this came to mind with what Brad just said, she loses touch with her sisters towards the middle of Pilgrimage, and she thinks about them every now and again, or she sees them every now and again, when Eve comes to London, for example. And palms Eleanor Deer off on her, you know, but they're kind of small encounters, whereas in Pointed Roofs, she thinks about them all the time because she's just come from that environment. So again, I feel like in March Moonlight, thinking about the sisters is a way of trying to come back to the beginning, or trying to wrap up, trying to, you know, as with maybe Michael and Amabel, giving everybody their final space on the stage to kind of give them some kind of conclusion, even if it's not a satisfactory one.
Right, and she does say when she's talking about the children that she regrets that she was spending more time with the London elite or whatever it was, and not keeping track of them. And you're right, and that pulls you right back into that time. So it's almost like a coda for a lot of these things. We're just getting and in fact, she keeps talking about the Chopin piece, that the Nocturne, is it, or whatever. I'd be curious to know, and she talked about punctuation in her essay on punctuation, as punctuation being similar to a musical score and the notes. And I'm sure people have thought of that, but I'm just thinking about it now, and here I go with monkey brain. To what extent is this a musical composition in 13 acts?
And Chopin, of course, at the time, people thought Chopin was crazy, you know, modern music, you know, all over the place. We listen to it now, and, you know, to me anyway, and just like, well, it sounds relatively traditional to me, but at the time, Chopin was a rule breaker. So maybe that makes more sense in that context.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're reaching the hour here, and I just wanted to offer anybody else who wants to have any, outgoing thoughts or foregoing thoughts about Pilgrimage. Are you going to read it again? Have you started to read it again? And would you recommend it to other readers? And I think also, would you recommend reading it in the context of a group where you do have an opportunity to work through these things book by it? To me, it seems like it's been a brilliant way to do it. That's not the way I read Pilgrimage the first time. It was straight through, and as Kim said, it's so nice to have pauses where you could reflect before you go back into Miriam's world.
Yeah, I think reading it in a group this way, Brad, I mean, I'm just so grateful I stumbled upon this. I still don't quite know how, but I feel like it was meant to be. So it's been a wonderful experience. And I think it's a very hard book to read on your own unless you have a purpose, or you've set yourself that objective, or somebody else has set you a task to do it. I think it would be all too easy to put it down and not pick it up again. But I think the way you've paced it has bin perfect. And because it is 13 volumes and it is just beyond a year, which is better than if it were 12, it sort of had that structure. And I don't know about other people here, but I think I'll always remember reading it through the year that we did read it in, because obviously there's the counterpoint of one's own life with the reading of it as well. So it's been a really special experience. Thank you.
I cannot remember how I stumbled upon it. I've tried several times to go back and say, now, how did I encounter this? And I can't come up with it. Does anyone remember how it appeared?
I don't know how everybody kind of came across it, but I do know that when I posted my first tweet about it, I left it for the evening because I was doing other things, and I came back the next morning and it had just gone. It had spread like wildfire, and there was so much more interest than I thought maybe one or two people would be like, oh yeah, I'll read it, and then kind of fizzle out after a little bit. So I was really surprised at the at the interest right from the start.
I know I
I
didn't.
think I read Kim's tweet. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, the original tweet got retweeted. I don't even remember the number now, but it got reposted by a ton of people. So I think people just came at it from different people's feeds and stuff. But
Yeah.
I never looked at Twitter ever until this year. So somehow it got outside of the Twitterverse.
Right.
I think neglected books led me to it
That might
somehow. That was probably, and I'm so happy it did, because as a literature and philosophy major who didn't think she was old enough to read any classics when she was in college, and then started reading Dickens 2 years ago, and then is moving into modernism, it's much nicer to have a gentle way to get into some of this in a nice discussion where the academics aren't afraid about to talk about somebody that nobody's written about. So I thank so much the people you've brought along to hold the lamp up while we fondle the elephant and different parts of it and mixing metaphors and mythology. But Brad, we all obviously feel the same way. I was going to send you a bouquet, but I didn't know your mailing address.
No, I mean, I have been so lucky. I've reached out to, a dozen Richardson scholars, and, none of them have gotten paid. They're all taking their own time to participate in the process. And it's just been such a wonderful addition to the whole experience. It certainly enriched my encounter with the novel the second time vastly. And it does seem to me, I mean, I mentioned I have a thought of a future project of a book that would be essentially, I wouldn't say a reader's guide to pilgrimage, but a guide to occasionally reach out and offer a helping hand and encourage people to go through, because I do think this is a book that enriches your life in numerous ways. And I will say, I think it's a book that many more men should read, because it's a healthy antidote to the very male-heavy perspective we still see.
Yeah, you could do it like that, like those a yoga thing I'm doing, which is 30 days of yoga, and so day one would be, because it would be nice to have your annotation as you're reading it, and so that it would be sort of parceled out like one seed at a time. But I think that would be really quite interesting. And eventually too, it would be lovely if, I think you've got it all there, but at some point to have on the website the various things we've been talking about, the various secondary sources, and not to turn it into a huge bibliography, but some of the more readable things by the people who've been presenting to us as in particular. Yeah, so that would be great.
Okay. Well, thank you, Rebecca. I had to leave. Anyone else want to jump in? We'll wrap it up here in the next few minutes. I just want to say thanks to all of you who have tuned into these various discussions. It's been great. We've always had at least a critical mass, even for the spotty months have been not too bad, and we had always had good discussions. So anyone else who wants to chime in? Sad to be done, some people are saying. Yes, reading experiences, it's tough. It's tough to follow up after this.
it looks like Howard has his hand up.
Oh, hi, Howard. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, I don't know if you can see me. I just wanted to say one thing, that many things I've enjoyed about this reading group. I wish my students at university were as good as all of you. It would make my job a lot easier as a lecturer. But one little thing that I really enjoyed about the reading group, and I have come across this once or twice at Richardson events, but very rarely. And that's people reading sections aloud. I think it was Karen did quite a lot of reading. And Miriam in Pilgrimage does talk about reading aloud with someone else, reading Villette or novels aloud. And at first sight, Pilgrimage might seem like the last thing you're going to read aloud because it's so dense and such difficult punctuation. But it was a real revelation to me to hear extended sections read aloud. And I think this really is a book. The poetic element of it really comes out when you hear it read aloud. That really struck me. Things which might, when they're just in your own head, reading it on the page, seem very, very dense, suddenly seem to flow when you hear it read aloud. So that was just one little thing that I just wanted to mention that the reading group was.
Miriam
And
makes
to me-
so many comments about voices and accents and sounds and how they're, and also she, you know, has in her last sort of anti-metaphor rant about, I'll tell her that I'm not going to think in words. And actually, what you're saying, Howard, is I think having it read to you aloud is not thinking in words, even though it's words that's being used. In a way, it's a voice. So I think that's a really cool observation. I mean, I think when I go back to reread it, I'm going to be at least muttering under my breath more often than I normally do.
Yeah, I
Can I
read,
also
I read several parts out loud to myself when I was reading it. And I was amazed at like how it flows and how much more immersed in the language I got when I did that.
I found reading it aloud was very much being part of the stream of the words, and the meaning is kind of there, but it's much more the sensation of being in the stream of the words. And that feels kind of true to some of the things she's trying to say to us. Yeah,
Very much.
Absolutely. My dream would be see an audiobook version of this with somebody like Juliet Stevenson, who's a wonderful narrator. There are a couple of the books are on LibriVox, but they're not professional readers, and I think they're all men, and it's a little bit jarring. Doesn't help with the flow because this is certainly and there were a few passages where I deliberately, you know, cut and pasted the text and passed it through a text-to-speech woman with an English accent, and it you know, it helps a lot. I would love to have the whole of Pilgrimage as an audiobook to go through, and you know, especially if you can, sometimes if you have this possibility is to read and listen at the same time, which is a even different kind of experience. So how long would it take? I want to say if Proust is any example, it's probably on the order of probably about 100 hours. I would guess 100 to 120 hours. So a substantial investment of time. It's funny when I read books, I very often, you know, will look at the number of pages, but I never, in an audiobook where you see it's, you know, 35 hours of listening, I will say, ooh, I have to think about this investment. I'll turn around and pick up the book without a second thought. So.
Well, what we need is a cruise, a Richardson cruise, where we could all just, however far you could get in 100 hours, we would just ride around London on a boat and reading it to each other.
Alternating readers.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
Some people get to sleep, some people.
Yeah, right. Yes, it's like those marathons, right.
Yeah,
Pretend that we're in Congress and we're filibustering.
I don't think you're going to be able to pass it by any of the major cruise companies yet.
Well, somebody must know somebody in London with a boat.
I cannot imagine Miriam on a modern day cruise ship.
Oh no, not at all.
Pure torture. Pure torture.
What do you think she would think of this?
Sleeping.
What do you think she would think of this? Our group reading, do you think?
Oh, I think she would be excited to see people
Yeah.
Really? You don't think she
Take-
would be horrified?
No,
I think she'd be,
That it should be completely individual.
I think she'd love the group until she didn't.
that sums it up, doesn't it?
I think
think
the
that
rupture,
there's-
the rup-
You
the
know,
rupture
the,
with the Roscorlis is quite disturbing. That the Quaker family, the way that all goes, it's, yeah.
Yeah.
And I didn't think that one would go that way, but it goes the same way they all go, really.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, that was quite shocking.
Yeah.
well, she, I mean, there may be no character in literature who so embodies Groucho Marx, joke about, I would never be a member of a club that would have me. He's very anti-group in that sense, but I think group issue aside, I think she would be,
Yeah.
thrilled
I
to see.
don't know about a group, but a cruise, but Scott and myself, we have been fantasizing about a Richardson conference held in the Swiss Alps.
Oh,
If we could get funding and everyone,
and we'd have to have
beautiful
toboggans.
season,
Yes.
Yes.
Toboggans
That's
for
right,
sure. Yeah.
Even reading in a park as a group, reading in a park in London would probably be all
That
right.
could be, that could be good. Yeah, or on the Heath.
No, I could do that anytime.
Yes.
I want the
Okay.
Swiss, I want
Oh, you want to be exotic.
Okay.
We would have to make sure that the first chapter of the tunnel, though, that we'd move into a dentist's office.
I Xeroxed some of it and gave it to my dentist.
Didn't we just ride around the tube and read it?
Yeah,
Sure.
right.
Probably.
I really like the fact it's been online and it's been in space. That sort of feels very suitable.
Through the
Absolutely.
tubes.
I'm not sure we would have gotten a critical mass in any maybe London, but I don't know if there'd be many places we could get more than a handful of readers to commit to pilgrimage over the course of a year. So yeah, I mean, it's been fabulous to be able to do this online for sure. And if you look at it, we've had participation everywhere from Australia to California, Washington, Montana. So that's been terrific as well. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you for sticking with Miriam and Dorothy and me for the last year. It's been a fabulous experience. I hope I have the means to put this together sometime in future. And I will certainly let folks know. The site will stay up. I'll occasionally add material as I see something interesting. And if you have stuff that you would like to see on the site, just send me an email and I'll be happy to try to accommodate it. But thank you again. Thank you, Kim, for having the idea in the first place.
Thank you so much. This has been really rewarding. So I really appreciate having your website and all of the academics that we've had, and it's been really fun.
It really has. So thank you all. And with that, I will say adieu and auf Wiedersehen and au revoir, let's say. I guess that's a better way to say. We'll hope to see you again sometime. And if not, happy reading. Thanks very much.
Continue
Thank
the
you.
pilgrimage.